They once denied him water, just a single glass, under a roof built to keep the sun out and the dust low, and somehow that was enough to change the fate of an entire valley. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Somewhere dry? Somewhere where a man can still ask for water without earning a room full of laughter? Because out here, in the late summer of 1872, in a place called Dust Hollow, water was worth more than kindness, and kindness was something most men had long since traded away. The wind moved slow that afternoon, dragging heat across the wooden fronts of the buildings like it had nowhere better to be, carrying with it the smell of leather, sweat, and old whiskey soaked into the floorboards of the only saloon in town, and inside, where the light cut through the swinging doors in narrow golden lines, men leaned back in their chairs with the kind of ease that comes from owning land, or at least believing they did, boots stretched out, hats tilted low, voices low but sharp, the sound of coins and glass punctuating the still air, until the doors creaked again and someone stepped in who didn't belong. No one looked up right away, not at first, because men like him came through from time to time, quiet, worn, carrying more road than future in their eyes. But something about the way he stopped just inside the threshold, letting the dust settle around his boots, made a few heads turn, slow and deliberate, like wolves catching a scent they weren't sure they liked. He wasn't much to look at by Dust Hollow standards. Coat faded to the color of dry earth, sleeves frayed, hat pulled low enough to hide most of his face. But it was the boots that told the story, cracked leather, soles worn thin, the kind of boots that had walked farther than most men in that room ever would, and yet had brought him nowhere that mattered. He stepped forward, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, and the boards beneath him gave a quiet creak that seemed louder than it should have been, as if the building itself noticed him, and he reached the bar, resting one hand against the worn wood, fingers rough, knuckles marked by work no one here had seen. And when he spoke, his voice was low, even, the kind that didn't ask for much, just enough to get by. "Water," he said. And for a moment, nothing happened, not a word, not a movement, just the sound of a fly buzzing somewhere near the window and the faint clink of glass as the bartender wiped the same spot over and over again, like he hadn't heard, or maybe like he had and didn't like what it meant. And then someone chuckled, soft at first, from the far end of the room, a sound that didn't carry humor so much as permission, and it spread, slow and easy, from one man to the next, until the room was filled with it, not loud, not cruel in the way shouting is cruel, but steady, certain, like a truth everyone already agreed on. The bartender finally looked up, eyes sliding over the man in front of him, taking in the dust, the wear, the absence of anything worth respecting, and he reached for a glass, held it for a second, then set it back down without filling it, the gesture small but heavy enough to land. "Water's for paying men," he said, voice flat, not angry, not even unkind, just settled, like a rule written somewhere no one questioned, and a few men shifted in their chairs, boots scraping wood, watching now, waiting to see if the stranger would argue, if he'd raise his voice, if he'd make himself worth remembering for more than a moment. But the man didn't move, not right away, just stood there, hands still resting on the bar, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat, as if he were measuring something no one else could see, the weight of the room, the cost of a glass of water, the distance between who he was and who they believed him to be, and outside, beyond the walls, the valley stretched wide and dry under the sun, quiet, waiting, like it already knew something the men inside did not, like it remembered something they had forgotten. And in the corner, near the door where the light was thinnest, a young Apache girl stood half-hidden, watching him with eyes that didn't laugh, didn't judge, just watched, as if she understood that this moment, this small, quiet refusal, was not the end of something, but the beginning. The laughter did not end when he stood still. It settled into the room like dust after a long ride, clinging to every surface, every man, every thought, until it became part of the air itself. And the stranger did something that most men in that room did not expect. He did not argue. He did not beg. He did not even look up. He simply nodded once, slow, almost respectful, as if the refusal had weight that deserved acknowledgement. And he turned away from the bar with the same steady movement he had used to approach it, boots dragging a thin line of dust across. the wooden floor as he walked toward the door, and that was when the laughter shifted, not louder, but sharper, edged now with something closer to curiosity. Because men understand anger, they understand pride, but quiet acceptance unsettles them in ways they cannot name. Someone near the window leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, watching the man pass like he was trying to place him, to remember if he had seen that face somewhere before. But there was nothing to hold on to, no name, no reputation, no land tied to him. Just a man who had asked for water and been told no, and had taken it like it was already expected. The bartender shook his head, half amused, half dismissive, and reached for a bottle behind him, pouring a drink for a rancher who had not even asked yet, the liquid catching the light as it filled the glass. And the message was clear without needing to be spoken. Some men did not have to ask, and others could not ask enough. The stranger pushed the saloon doors open, and the late afternoon sun hit him full in the face, bright and unforgiving, the kind of light that showed every crack, every crease, every mile written into his skin. And he paused just outside, not for long, just long enough for the heat to settle on him again, for the sound of laughter behind him to fade into something distant, something less important than the open stretch of land ahead. Dust Hollow did not offer much beyond what could be seen at a glance, a handful of buildings, a few scattered fences, and beyond that, miles of dry valley that looked like it had forgotten what rain felt like, the ground hard and pale, the horizon trembling under the weight of heat. And somewhere out there, water moved quietly, hidden, patient, waiting for the right hands to find it. He stepped off the wooden porch and into the dirt, each step sending up small clouds that lingered for a second before disappearing. Like the town itself had a habit of forgetting things quickly, people included, and he moved past the hitching post where horses shifted lazily, their tails flicking at flies, their eyes half closed against the sun, and one of them lifted its head as he passed, watching him with a calm that felt closer to understanding than anything he had found inside. Behind him, the saloon doors swung once, twice, then settled, and the laughter inside carried on without him, filling the space he had left behind as if he had never been there at all. But not everything had turned away. The young Apache girl had followed him out, quiet as the shadow of a cloud, her small figure stopping a few feet from the porch, her eyes fixed on him with a focus that did not belong to someone her age, and she held something in her hands, a small leather pouch tied with a thin strip, worn but cared for, the kind of thing that carried meaning beyond its size. He noticed her without turning his head, the way a man notices wind shifting direction or the presence of something living nearby, and he slowed his steps just enough to give her time to close the distance if she chose to. But he did not look back, not yet. She stepped forward, one foot, then another, until she stood beside him, and for a moment they were just two figures in the open light, neither speaking, neither rushing, the silence between them carrying more weight than the noise inside ever could. She glanced toward the saloon, then back at him, and her brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in a quiet kind of disapproval, as if she had seen something she did not agree with but did not need to explain. And then she reached into the pouch, pulling out a small piece of dried meat, offering it to him with a hand that did not tremble. He looked at it, then at her, really looked this time, taking in the dark eyes, the steady posture, the absence of fear, and something shifted in his expression, subtle, almost invisible, but real, and he accepted it without a word, nodding once again, the same way he had inside. But this time the gesture meant something different, something closer to gratitude than acknowledgement. He broke the piece in half, offering it back to her, and she hesitated for just a second before taking it. And they stood there, sharing something small under a sky that had offered them nothing. And in that moment, with dust moving slow across the valley and the town behind them already forgetting, a different kind of exchange had begun, one that the land itself seemed to notice, holding it quietly, like a promise not yet spoken. The sun was still high when they finished that small, quiet meal, but the heat had begun to soften, stretching shadows longer across the dry ground, and the man turned his gaze toward the open valley as if measuring something beyond distance, something deeper than land, while the girl watched him with that same steady focus, her presence calm but deliberate, like she had chosen to stand there and was not yet finished with whatever reason had brought her. He reached into the inside pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small canteen, dinted, nearly empty, the kind of thing a man carries not for comfort, but for survival, and he unscrewed the cap slowly, tipping it just enough to see how little remained, a thin line of water catching the light before settling again, and for a moment he held it there, weighing it in his hand, knowing exactly what it meant, how far it could stretch, how long it could keep him moving across land that did not forgive mistakes. He lifted it toward his lips, paused, then lowered it again without taking a sip, and instead he extended it toward the girl, offering it the same way she had offered the food, without words, without expectation, just a simple act placed between them. She looked at the canteen, then at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand the choice, because she had seen what happened inside the saloon. She had seen what men did when they believed something was scarce, and this was different. This was a man giving away the last of what he had been denied. She accepted it slowly, careful, both hands wrapping around the metal, and she drank only a small amount, no more than needed, then handed it back with the same care, and when their hands brushed for a brief second, there was something unspoken that passed between them, not trust exactly, not yet, but recognition, the kind that does not come from words but from choices. He tightened the cap and slipped the canteen back into his coat, and the girl reached behind her neck, fingers working at a thin leather cord that had been hidden beneath her shirt, and she pulled it free, revealing a small bracelet, simple, made of worn leather and threaded with a single bead carved in a pattern that caught the light just enough to be noticed, and she held it out to him, her arm steady, her expression unchanged. He hesitated this time, not because he did not understand the gesture, but because he did, and he knew it carried weight beyond its size, something tied to her people, to something older than the town behind them, and he glanced down at it, then back at her face, searching for hesitation, for doubt, but finding none. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant water, and somewhere far off, a hawk circled slowly in the sky, its shadow moving across the ground like a silent witness. He reached out and took the bracelet, his fingers closing around it carefully, almost gently, as if it might break if he did not respect it. And for the first time since he had stepped into the saloon, something in his posture changed, subtle, but real, like a man who had been standing against the wind and had just found a direction instead. The girl nodded once, a small motion, then stepped back, her role in this moment complete, and she turned toward the edge of town, where the land opened into something wider, something less defined, and she began to walk without looking back, her steps light but certain, leaving faint prints in the dust that the wind would soon erase. He watched her go for a few seconds, long enough to see her disappear past the last fence post, long enough to understand that whatever had just happened was not something the town would notice, not something the men inside would ever speak of, and yet it carried more weight than their laughter ever could. He looked down at the bracelet in his hand, turning it slightly, the bead catching the sun again, and he slipped it over his wrist, the leather settling against his skin like it had always belonged there. And then he lifted his eyes to the valley once more, the wide stretch of land that had seemed empty before now holding a different kind of meaning, something quiet, something waiting. Behind him, the town continued as it always had, voices rising and falling, boots scraping wood, deals being made and forgotten. But out here, beyond the reach of that noise, a different kind of story had begun to take shape, one that did not need an audience, one that did not ask for recognition, only time. And as he took his first step away from Dust Hollow, leaving the buildings, the laughter, and the refusal behind him, the wind moved again, carrying dust across the ground and into the distance, as if the land itself had decided to remember. He did not look back again after that, not at the saloon, not at the men who had already forgotten his face, not at the doorway where laughter still lived like something permanent, because men like him learned early that looking back only ties you to places that never intended to keep you. And the valley ahead stretched wide and quiet, the kind of silence that did not judge, did not measure, only waited. The ground was hard beneath his boots, dry enough that each step carried a dull echo through the soles, and the air held that late afternoon stillness where even the wind seemed to think twice before moving, as if it knew that something had shifted, something small but certain. He walked for miles without seeing another soul, the town shrinking behind him until it became nothing more than a suggestion on the horizon, a cluster of shapes swallowed by distance and heat, and the land opened in ways that most men never noticed, shallow dips where rain once gathered, narrow lines in the earth that hinted at water buried far below, places where grass grew just a shade greener than the rest, quiet signs that meant nothing to those who only saw what was in front of them, but everything to someone who had learned to read what was hidden. The bracelet rested against his wrist, light but constant, a reminder that the day had not been empty, that something had been given where nothing had been expected, and every so often his thumb brushed against the small carved bead, tracing its edges as if committing it to memory, not as an object, but as a moment. As the sun began to lower, the light shifted from harsh white to a softer gold, stretching shadows long across the valley floor, and he found a small rise overlooking a shallow bend in the land where the ground dipped just enough to suggest that water might pass through in a different season, and he stopped there, not because he was tired, but because something about the place felt right, the kind of right that does not announce itself, only settles quietly in the chest. He crouched down and pressed his hand into the soil, feeling the texture, the faint coolness just beneath the surface, and he stayed there for a moment, listening, not with his ears, but with something deeper, the way a man listens when he knows the answer will not come in words. The sky above him stretched wide and endless, painted in slow fading color, and a breeze finally moved through the valley, carrying with it a whisper of something distant, something that did not belong to dust or dryness, and he closed his eyes for just a second, letting it pass over him, letting it settle. When he opened them again, there was no hesitation left in him, no question about direction, only movement, and he stood, adjusting his coat, setting his shoulders like a man who had chosen something without needing to explain it. The night came slowly, the kind that does not rush, just folds itself over the land inch by inch, and he made a small fire from what little dry wood he could gather, the flames low and steady, enough to push back the dark, but not enough to announce his presence to anything that might be watching, and he sat beside it, silent, the bracelet catching the firelight in small flashes that came and went like memory. He drank the last of his water then, not in desperation, but in decision, finishing it completely, leaving nothing behind, because he understood that what came next would not be about what he carried with him, but what he could find, what he could build, what he could become in a place that had not yet decided his worth. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, the sound stretching thin across the valley, and he listened without reacting, just letting it be part of the night, part of the space he now occupied. And when the fire burned low, he lay back against the earth, looking up at a sky filled with more stars than most men ever bothered to count. And there, under that wide, indifferent sky, with nothing to his name but a worn coat, a quiet resolve, and a small piece of leather tied around his wrist, he made no promise out loud, no vow that needed to be heard, only a decision that settled into him like the land itself, steady, patient, and waiting for its time. Morning did not arrive with relief. It came the way it always did in that part of the country, slow and dry, carrying more light than promise, and the man was already awake before the first color touched the horizon, sitting where the fire had turned to ash, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the stretch of land below him, as if he had been watching it all night without moving. The air held a faint chill that would disappear within the hour, and for a brief moment, the valley felt different, quieter, almost willing to reveal something before the heat returned to close it off again. He stood and stepped down from the rise, boots pressing into soil that looked lifeless but felt otherwise beneath the surface, and he walked along the natural curve of the land, following lines that most men would miss, shallow impressions that spoke of water long gone, but not forgotten. He moved slowly, not wandering, not searching in the way desperate men search, but observing, reading, letting the land speak in its own quiet language, and every few yards he paused, crouched, pressed his hand into the ground, then moved again, patient in a way that only comes from understanding that rushing changes nothing. The bracelet on his wrist caught the early light again, the small bead reflecting just enough to draw the eye, and he turned it once, thoughtful, as if measuring the weight of what had been given to him against what he was about to take on. By the Time the sun had cleared the horizon. He had found it. Not water itself. Not yet. But the place where it lived, hidden beneath layers of dust and time. A narrow strip of land where the soil held a deeper tone, where small cracks ran in patterns that suggested movement below, slow and steady. And he stood there for a long moment, saying nothing, doing nothing, just letting the certainty settle. He marked the spot without tools, without stakes, just by memory, by the angle of the hills, the shape of a distant rock formation, the way the light fell across the ground, storing it in the kind of detail that does not fade. Days turned into weeks in a way that felt both slow and inevitable. Each morning beginning before the sun, each evening ending under a sky that stretched endless and indifferent, and he worked with what little he had, hands turning earth, clearing space, shaping something out of nothing, not in large gestures, not in ways that would draw attention, but in small, deliberate actions that built upon each other, one layer at a time. He walked miles to trade for tools that most men would not have considered worth the effort, bartering labor for metal, for rope, for anything that could help him reach what lay beneath the surface. And when he returned alone, always alone, carrying just enough to continue. There were days when the ground refused to give, when the soil hardened under the sun and the work felt like it would lead nowhere. And on those days he did not curse, did not stop. He simply adjusted, changed his angle, waited for the right moment, and continued, because he understood something that the men in Dust Hollow did not, that the land does not respond to force, it responds to patience. The first sign came quietly, almost unnoticed, a dampness in the soil where there had been none before, a darker shade that lingered even under the heat, and he knelt there, pressing his fingers into it, feeling the coolness that had been hidden for so long. And he did not smile, did not celebrate. He simply nodded once, the same way he had in the saloon, the same way he had when he accepted the bracelet, because for him, this was not surprise, it was confirmation. He dug deeper after that, careful, measured, and when the water finally showed itself, not as a rush, not as something dramatic, but as a slow, steady presence that gathered and held, he sat back on his heels and watched it for a long time, listening to the faint sound it made as it moved through the earth, a sound so quiet it could be missed entirely if one did not know to listen. He cupped the small amount in his hand and lifted it to his lips, not out of thirst alone, but out of respect, and when he drank, it was not hurried, not desperate, it was deliberate, like sealing something that had begun the moment a glass had been denied. The valley did not change overnight, not in ways that could be seen from a distance, but something had shifted, something had begun, and as the days continued, the work grew, the water held, and the man who had once been turned away for asking for a single glass now stood on land that had given him more than he had asked for, not because it owed him, but because he had learned how to listen. Time did not rush for him. It stretched, folded, and settled into something steady, the kind of rhythm that does not need to be measured because it becomes part of the man living it. And the valley began to answer in quiet ways that no one in Dust Hollow would have noticed even if they had been standing right there beside him. The small pool he had uncovered deepened inch by inch, then widened, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention from miles away, but enough to change the color of the earth around it, enough for the ground to soften where it had once been stubborn, enough for a few thin strands of green to push through the dust like they had been waiting for permission. He built around it slowly, shaping channels with his hands and simple tools, guiding the water instead of forcing it, letting it find its own path across the land. And over time those paths held, forming lines that caught the morning light differently, lines that spoke of life returning in a place that had long been written off. Word did not travel fast out there, but it did travel, carried by men passing through, by traders who noticed things others missed, by those who measured land not just by what it was, but by what it could become, and the first to arrive was not a crowd, not a group, just a single rider who stopped at the edge of the valley and sat there for a long time, looking down at something that should not have been there, something that did not fit the story Dust Hollow had been telling for years. The man did not approach right away. He waited, watching as Elias moved through his work with the same quiet focus, the same steady pace. And when he finally rode closer, he did not ask questions at first. He only looked, taking in the water, the small growth, the way the land had begun to shift under careful hands. "You find that?" The rider asked eventually, his voice carrying curiosity without disbelief, and Elias did not answer immediately. He just glanced once toward the narrow stream he had guided, then back to the man, and gave a small nod, the same nod that had followed him from the saloon, from the valley, from every moment where words were unnecessary. The rider dismounted slowly, boots hitting softer ground than he expected, and he crouched near the edge of the water, pressing his fingers into it like he needed to confirm it was real, and something changed in his expression, not excitement, not greed, but understanding, the kind that comes when a man realizes he is looking at something that will not stay small for long. He stood and looked out across the valley again, seeing it differently now, not as dry land, but as something on the edge of transformation, and he turned back to Elias with a different kind of respect, one that had not been there when he arrived. "You planning to keep it?" he asked, and Elias held his gaze for a second, long enough for the answer to be clear before he spoke it quietly. "I am planning to build it," he said, and that was enough. The rider left that same day, but he did not leave empty. He carried the image with him, the knowledge of what lay beyond the horizon, and over the next months, more came, not many at first, a pair of brothers looking for work, a man with tools he was willing to trade, a woman who knew how to tend soil better than most, and each one arrived with the same cautious curiosity, the same need to see before believing, and each one left with something different, not always land, not always work, but a sense that something real was taking shape in a place that had once been ignored. Elias did not invite them, did not call them in. He simply allowed them to see, to choose, and those who stayed did so not because they were promised anything, but because they recognized something in the way he worked, in the way he treated the land, in the way he shared what it gave without holding it tight. The water spread, the green followed, and the valley began to hold more than silence. It held footsteps, voices, the low sounds of life returning piece by piece. And through it all, the bracelet remained on his wrist, worn now, shaped by time and work, but still present, still catching light in quiet moments, a reminder of where it had begun. Far beyond the valley, Dust Hollow continued as it always had, unaware or unwilling to notice the shift taking place just miles away, still holding to its habits, its rules, its laughter, but the land between them was changing, and change does not ask permission. It arrives slowly, settles deeply, and by the time it is seen clearly, it is already too late to pretend it is not there. By the time the 10th summer settled over the valley, it no longer resembled the place it had once been, not in the way it held light, not in the way it carried sound, and certainly not in the way men spoke about it in places like Dust Hollow, where the name had begun to surface more often, always with a tone that mixed disbelief with something quieter, something closer to unease. What had once been dry earth now stretched in long bands of green that followed the paths Elias had carved years before, the water moving steady and sure through channels that had become part of the land itself, feeding rows of crops, small orchards, and grazing fields where horses moved with a calm that only comes from abundance. Structures had risen slowly over time, not all at once, but piece by piece, each one built with purpose, not for show, not for pride, but because it was needed, and together they formed something that could no longer be ignored, a working valley, alive in a way that did not shout, did not demand attention, but held it all the same. People moved through it now, not many, but enough to give it voice, to give it presence, and they worked with the same rhythm that Elias had set from the beginning, steady, deliberate, respectful of what the land offered, and in return, the land continued to give. He moved among them without standing above them, without calling attention to himself, his coat no longer worn, his boots replaced but still carrying dust, the bracelet still resting against his wrist, darker now from years of sun and work, but unchanged in what it meant. He did not speak more than necessary, did not explain what had been built or how, because those who needed to understand already did, and those who did not would see it soon enough. Beyond the edges of the valley, the world had begun to shift in response, traders altering their routes, land buyers asking questions, men who had once dismissed the area now sending word ahead, trying to understand what had changed and whether it could be claimed, owned, or controlled. And that was how Dust Hollow finally noticed, not through memory, not through reflection, but through opportunity. the kind that makes men look twice at places they once ignored. Sheriff Cole Brennan stood outside the same saloon where laughter had once filled the air without consequence, his eyes fixed on the distant stretch of land that shimmered differently now under the sun, and he listened as a traveler described what lay beyond the ridge: water that did not dry, fields that did not fail, a man who had turned nothing into something that others now wanted a part of. Cole did not laugh this time. He did not dismiss it, because there was something in the description that unsettled him, something familiar in a way he could not place at first, and he narrowed his eyes slightly, searching his memory for a face, a moment, a detail that refused to fully surface. Days later, he rode out with a small group, not as a challenge, not as a threat, but as men do when they feel something slipping beyond their reach and want to see it before it is too late. And the ride took longer than expected, the land stretching wider than it seemed from town, until finally the valley opened before them, and what they saw did not match the stories they had told themselves for years. It was real, every bit of it: the water, the green, the movement, the quiet order that had replaced emptiness, and they slowed their horses without meaning to, the kind of hesitation that comes when certainty begins to crack. Cole dismounted first, boots touching ground that felt different beneath him, softer, alive in a way he had not expected, and he walked forward a few steps, eyes scanning, taking in the details, the channels, the crops, the people who worked without stopping to stare, as if visitors were no longer unusual. Then he saw him, standing near the edge of the main water line, not elevated, not positioned as a man in charge might be, but present, grounded, and for a moment Cole did not recognize him, because time had changed the shape of things, had added weight where there had once been none, had replaced absence with presence. But then the man turned slightly, just enough for the light to catch his face, and something in Cole's memory aligned, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to stir something he could not ignore. The distance between them held, no words crossing it yet, no movement breaking it, just two men standing in a place that had once meant nothing, now carrying more than either of them could have predicted, and the wind moved lightly through the valley, carrying with it the faint sound of water flowing, steady, unbothered, as if it had always been there, as if it had never once been denied. No one reached for a weapon, no one raised their voice, and yet the weight in the air shifted the moment Sheriff Cole Brennan took another step forward, because this was not the kind of place where men proved themselves with noise anymore. This was a place where silence carried more authority than any badge ever could. Cole stopped a few feet from the water's edge, his boots pressing into soil that gave slightly beneath him, unfamiliar in a way that made him uneasy, and he looked out across the narrow channel where the water moved with quiet certainty, then back at the man standing across from him, trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the memory that had begun to surface but still refused to fully settle. "You built all this," Cole said finally, his voice lower than it used to be, stripped of the easy confidence it once carried, and Elias did not answer right away. He simply let the question hang there, the same way the valley held its silence, steady and patient, before giving a small nod that was less about pride and more about acknowledgement of what already was. The men behind Cole shifted slightly, their horses restless in the unfamiliar softness of the ground, their eyes moving from the water to the fields to the people working without interruption, and there was no challenge in their stance, no claim being made, only the quiet realization that they had arrived too late to shape what stood before them. Cole took another step, closer now, his gaze dropping briefly to the bracelet on Elias's wrist, the worn leather, the single bead catching light in a way that felt deliberate, and something in his expression tightened, not in anger, but in recognition, a memory forming at the edges of his thoughts, incomplete but insistent. "This land," Cole began again, his tone shifting towards something more measured, more careful. "It used to belong to no one." And the words hung there, carrying an implication that did not need to be spoken aloud, the idea that what was once empty could be taken, could be claimed by those who arrived later with authority or papers or force of habit. Elias looked at him then, fully, not with defiance, not with challenge, but with a calm that did not bend, and when he spoke, his voice was as steady as the water moving beside them. "It still does," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument could have, Because it did not deny ownership, it redefined it. Cole exhaled slowly, glancing back at the men behind him, then out across the valley again, seeing now not just what had been built, but how it had been built, the absence of fences where they were not needed, the presence of boundaries that were understood without being marked. And he realized that whatever claim he thought he might have carried with him did not fit here, did not hold. Men are going to come, Cole said after a moment, not as a threat, but as a statement, the kind that acknowledges something inevitable. Buyers, investors, men with papers, and Elias nodded again, already aware, already prepared in ways that did not require defense. They can come, he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no concern, only a quiet certainty that what had been built would not be undone by those who did not understand it. The wind moved through the valley then, carrying the scent of water and growing things, brushing past them both without choosing sides. And from the far end of the main channel, a figure approached, walking with the same steady rhythm that the land itself seemed to follow, her presence drawing attention without demanding it. Nara had changed, as time changes all things, no longer the quiet child standing in the shadow of a saloon, but a woman whose steps carried purpose, whose gaze held the same clarity, but with something deeper behind it, something shaped by years, by distance, by understanding. She stopped beside Elias, not behind him, not ahead of him, but beside him, and she looked at Cole with a calm that mirrored the valley itself. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, because some moments do not need words to define them. Cole shifted his weight slightly, his eyes moving from her to the bracelet, then back again, and whatever question had been forming in his mind seemed to settle into something quieter, something closer to acceptance than resistance. Nara reached down then, dipping a small cup into the flowing water, lifting it carefully, the surface catching the light before settling again, and she stepped forward just enough to close the distance, extending it toward Cole without urgency, without insistence, just offering it the way something real is offered, without condition. The movement was simple, almost nothing, but it held more meaning than anything that had been said, and Cole looked at the cup, then at her, then at Elias. And in that space between what had been and what was now, he understood something that could not be undone, not by time, not by authority, not by memory. He reached out and took it slowly, his hand steady but his expression quieter than it had ever been. And when he lifted it, he did not rush, did not hesitate. He simply drank, the water passing from one hand to another in a way that completed something that had begun years ago without anyone in that saloon realizing it. And when he lowered the cup, no one spoke, because nothing needed to be added to what had already been understood. The valley did not celebrate what had just happened. It did not echo with cheers or mark the moment with anything that could be seen from a distance, because places like that did not need to announce their meaning. They simply held it, quiet and steady, the same way water held its course through the land without asking to be noticed. Sheriff Cole Brennan stood there for a moment longer after lowering the cup, the taste of clean water still settling on his tongue, and something in his posture changed in a way that no one would have called dramatic, but everyone present could feel, like a man who had been carrying a weight he did not know how to name, and had just set it down, without realizing when it had begun. He handed the cup back to Nara with a small, deliberate motion, not rushed, not reluctant, and when their hands met briefly, there was no tension there, only the simple exchange of something that had already said what needed to be said. He looked once more at Elias, not searching now, not trying to place him in a memory that no longer mattered, but seeing him as he stood, a man shaped by years the town had not witnessed, a man who had taken something small and turned it into something that could not be taken away, not because he held it tightly, but because he had built it in a way that did not depend on permission. Cole gave a slight nod, the kind that does not ask for acknowledgement in return, and he turned back toward his horse, his steps slower than when he had arrived, more measured, as if each one carried a thought he was still working through. The men who had ridden with him followed without speaking, their earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something that did not need to be explained, and as they mounted and began the ride back toward Dust Hollow, none of them looked over their shoulders, not because they did not want to, but because they understood that what lay behind them was not something that would change by being watched. The valley remained as it was, the water moving, the fields breathing, the people continuing their work without pause, and Elias stood where he had been, not watching them leave, not marking their departure, just present, the bracelet on his wrist catching the late afternoon light in small, steady flashes. Nara moved beside him, her gaze following the line of the water rather than the riders, her expression unchanged, as if the moment that had just passed was not an ending, but simply another step in something that had begun long before either of them had the words to name it. As the sun began to lower, casting a warm, golden light across the valley, a young boy from one of the working families ran toward the channel, stopping at the edge where the water flowed clear and steady, and he crouched down, dipping his hands into it with a quiet kind of wonder that had not yet been shaped by memory or expectation. He looked up at Elias for a brief second, as if asking permission without speaking, and Elias gave the same small nod he had given so many times before, the same one that carried trust without needing to explain it, and the boy smiled faintly before drinking, the moment simple, unremarkable to anyone who did not understand what it meant. Far away, Dust Hollow continued under the same sun, the same dry wind moving through its streets, the same saloon doors swinging open and closed. But something there had shifted, not in the buildings, not in the land, but in the space between men, in the way a memory could return when it was least expected, carrying with it the weight of something once dismissed. And out in the valley, where water now moved where it once had not, where green grew where there had been only dust, no one spoke of ownership. No one spoke of who deserved what, because the land had already answered that question in its own way, quiet and certain, and as the light faded and the first stars began to show, the valley held its silence again, not empty, not forgotten, but full of something that did not need to be named, because out there, justice did not arrive with noise, it arrived the way water does, slowly, patiently, and once it was there, it did not leave.